All right, let's get to it with question number one, which comes from Bob in Virginia. Okay, Bob says, what are important post-harvest or fall tasks for non-bearing young vines to complete at this time of year in the fall? Is there an ideal time to stop spraying for diseases? And when can you stop irrigation? Okay, Bob, really great question. I appreciate you being very specific that this is a question for non-bearing young vines. So let's say they're 1, 2, or 3 years old, probably 1 or 2 years in the ground at minimum. When it comes to young vines and getting them established well, I really don't like to stress the vines in terms of irrigation. So if you're not getting rain in the beautiful state of Virginia as we get into the fall and into harvest, if the hurricane season and tropical storm season did not come your way, then it's a good idea to water and make sure that your vines are getting adequate moisture all the way up until leaf drop. And then if you need to water in the winter, it's even an option to do that. However, typically in the eastern United States, where we have good rainfall in the fall, we definitely don't need to water in the wintertime. But I do know that some growers in more arid regions will even water in the winter to make sure they don't lose precious root area on those young vines. We're trying to build new structures like trunks and cordons and spur positions, so we just don't want that to happen. Now, I can't tell you how much to water, but what I can say is you'll want to water at least to the depth of your roots and maybe beyond that, just to make sure that your roots have some room to grow. There is a little bit of a root flush in the fall that coincides rather with veraison, leading to harvest, so you want to make sure you have good, adequate soil moisture. Now, I can also say for the disease management aspect of your question, you do want to control in your area specifically downy mildew and probably powdery mildew. Those are the two major foliar diseases that can take leaf area out prematurely in the fall. So the good news is if you have a non-bearing vineyard, there are many options you can spray without having to regard a pre-harvest interval because you're not harvesting fruit on these young vines. And if you are trying to harvest a small crop, then the pre-harvest interval of any product will need to be taken into consideration. But there are some lesser expensive products that are broad spectrum against powdery mildew and downy mildew. Sulfur, for example, can be used on powdery mildew for prevention, as long as it's not too hot, usually above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. You can see some scorch on the leaves. And there are some other broad spectrum fungicides for downy mildew that growers are using in the eastern United States. Organic version might be something like copper. However, it's not highly effective in high pressure. Some growers in your region also use a product called Mancozeb. Again, none of these are recommendations. I'm just making sure I'm specific, so I leave you with a few examples of what I know growers are using in your neck of the woods. I've worked in Virginia, and I know the state quite well in terms of viticulture. Okay, we're going to stay in Illinois for the next vineyard question, and it's coming from Chad. Chad says, I have about 50 Marichal Foch vines in the middle of my half-acre vineyard. Between herbicide and late frost, they haven't thrived after their fourth year. I also need and want to add an entertainment area to the middle of my vineyard, which would be perfect where these Marichal Foch are currently planted. Therefore, I've made the tough decision that I will need to remove these vines. Do I have to dig up the roots and everything, or can I just chainsaw each vine flush with the ground? We would like to entertain on this land, so what do you recommend? And also, would you suggest that I do this in the fall or dormant pruning season? When is the best time to remove vines that are destined for removal? Okay, I get the idea here. So, Chad, this is a logical thing to do since we know that if you have a winery, an entertainment area, that is going to be very important to the economics of your vineyard. I hate to see vines ripped out for these purposes, but you've clearly stated that these vines are in their fourth leaf, had a rough go at the beginning between herbicide and other factors. So I always say if you don't have a vine established by year 4, at least with a trunk that's sturdy and good growth, it's probably not going to make it in the long haul anyway. So I totally get it. Let's rip these vines out. The best time to remove vines would be in the fall or in the winter, depending on if the ground's frozen or not. We don't want frozen ground, but you definitely want to do it after you have adequate soil moisture or after the rainy season. So a lot of times this ends up being in the fall, late fall, or early winter. And so the idea is if you just go through and chainsaw or cut your vines at soil level, You're leaving the root behind. So those roots are going to push a whole lot of shoots in the spring. And these sucker shoots coming from the ground are going to be from, even if they're not from the rootstock, if you planted your Marichal Fauche on its own roots, then it's going to be putting shoots up of that variety. And it's going to be hard to get it out because you have nothing to grab onto. You don't have a trunk anymore. So what I suggest is that you put a chain around that trunk, and after the soil is adequately wet, you pull up on that chain with a front end loader or some type of device that will crank that vine out of the ground. And if some of the root system breaks off in the process and a little bit of roots left behind, that's okay. That probably won't grow into a new vine. But if you leave that crown behind, that's that area right at the head of, or the base rather, of the trunk where the roots are derived from in that primary root ball. If you leave that behind, that's where your shoots are going to grow from. So I strongly recommend getting rid of the crown. I recommend pulling out with the chain. If you want to get a small excavator or backhoe in there and actually rip the vines out that way, that's easy to do too. And if you're taking out the trellis, which it sounds like you are, you could also plow or rip the roots out because there won't be any trellis in the way to do that. Any kind of equipment that would excavate that you could easily get into the area would work. So I'm going to say do whatever's cheapest, most effective, and fastest, and get the crown of that root system out of the ground. Let's see what Jeff in Texas has to say about his vineyard. Jeff says, our Tempranillo vineyard has recovered from the St. Patrick's Day freeze here in 2026 and is doing fairly well. However, we have seen some replacement plants that are in their third leaf that are showing leaves that are a bit lighter green than the mature plants that are adjacent to them. I was wondering if the more mature plants are robbing nutrients from the younger vines, causing this paleness on the leaves. Should I add some spot nutrients to the third leaf replacements? Okay, so Jeff, this is a really good question, and there is definitely always a challenge trying to establish replant vines in and among mature vines that are, let's say, 7, 8, 9 years or older, right? So vines that have well-established root systems. The older they are, the more root system they have established, and the harder, theoretically, it becomes to put replants in between these vines and hope that they're going to survive and thrive. So it sounds like your vines are doing well in the replant situation. However, if they're uniformly pale green, this is definitely a sign of nitrogen deficiency. It could also be sulfur deficiency, but more than likely it's nitrogen deficiency. So you could sample those vines, the young ones, do a leaf sample right around bloom, or do it again at veraison, or both, and send that leaf blade sample in to check nitrogen levels and all the other nutrients to make sure there are not any deficiencies. And if there are, you can always adjust accordingly and fertilize. Now, if you just think that the leaves are a little pale green and you feel that the older vines are competing, which I think probably they are, you can go in and add a small amount of multiple purpose fertilizer if you wanted to just do something safe. However, I prefer getting the data and applying only what's needed, when it's needed, and in the amount that it's needed. The other thing you can do is you could add some organic fertilizer or organic matter in the form of compost. So you can pile some compost at the base of those vines. Sometimes that's helpful for suppressing weeds. You also want to make sure that the weed competition in your replant area, that area directly around the trunk of your replant vines, is not getting out of hand. Sometimes grasses grow in, summer weeds can grow in, and older vines can withstand some of that weed competition better than young vines because they have deeper root systems and generally more carbohydrate reserves to keep the vines happy. So if there's anything you can do to decrease the competition of weeds or ground cover around the base of your vines, whether it's hand hoeing, whether it's use of a spray product, whether it's organic or conventional to knock back those competitive plants at the base of the vine, that could help. And then you, of course, would want to do that before you add any fertilizer. Otherwise, you're just going to be fertilizing the ground cover. The other thing is water. Sometimes watering the whole vineyard as one is not enough for those young replants. So you either need to go in and with a water truck or a container do some additional watering, or if the replant is significant enough, this is probably not the case for you, but some growers have actually added a second drip line where they're trying to establish young vines. They just pop an emitter in on that second drip line and do an additional watering during the course of the week or every 2 weeks to make sure that those young vines are getting water in between. So this is there's a bunch of things I'm hitting this with, but to answer your question, A little fertilizer goes a long way. Make sure the ground cover is not overly competitive. Make sure the vines next door don't have shoots that are growing over top and blocking sun from your young vines. You could use C-clips and other ties to keep those shoots out of the way. And just make sure your vines are getting the due attention they need, because they're young, Jeff. They're just kids out there. They need your help. Pay attention. They need attention, just like young children, Jeff.